So, hello everybody, this is Bante Joe here, and I'm actually just here at the ruins called Endagala. So this is kind of a large rock in the middle of the jungle actually, and there's been stairs and things carved into it, and looks like it might have once been like a Mahaterakuti. And so actually got a message from a friend from TBC the other day, and she'd mentioned about possibly doing a Dhamma talk, and the connection can be a bit spotty out here, so I thought, maybe try to record something instead. So she wrote back and suggested that, or said, do you have any themes that might be interested in? She said maybe the Noble Eightfold Path. So I thought to try to come out here and to this kind of a beautiful location, which is actually very close to the monastery, and maybe do a little recording on the Noble Eightfold Path. So might just start by paying homage in the usual way. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So then hello to everybody in Toronto at TBC. And nice to join everybody via kind of the amazing internet technology. The world has become a kind of very small place. You can be in the middle of the jungle or, middle of the forest in Sri Lanka, and yet these things can, in the matter of a kind of like a day or an hour or whatever, these things can reach all the way over to Toronto. And so Ruvi had mentioned that might be interested in a talk on the Noble Eightfold Path for maybe like a half hour or half hour to 45 minutes. So see what I can do here. It's actually just me here in the middle. So me and my camera, my phone. So see what can do. And so the Noble Eightfold Path is one of the kind of cornerstones of the Buddha's teachings. Kind of, it's one of what they call the Bodhipakya Dhammas. But as he was nearing the end of his life, the Buddha gave this list of different sets that were kind of emblematic of his teaching, that comprised his teaching, that had the main emphases of these teachings. The Noble Eightfold Path is one. And obviously the Noble Eightfold Path is the last point, and most importantly, the last point in the Four Noble Truths, which are the kind of central teaching of Buddhism. And so this Noble Eightfold Path is obviously something kind of very important, kind of what you might call the Buddha's path to Nibbana. It's meant to be a path that leads to the end of suffering, the end of what they call dukkha, and it has 8 different factors. So the first factor, the one that's said to be the most important, is right view. Right view. And basically in the text it gets defined kind of like, he has the view that, I can't remember the exact wording and didn't do much studying before, but, basically has the view that, there is basically good and bad actions, there is mother and father, there's an afterlife, there's these various beings. And that basically comprises what they call mundane right view. When a person has this kind of right view, that the actions that they take, that they make a difference, then that person kind of makes investments based on those actions. If a person has the idea that, when they die, the consequences of their actions carry over, then they invest differently than if they think after death we all become stardust. We all kind of, disappear into the ether or whatever, and with the death of our physical body, with the death of our brain, there's nothing else. When a person has that view, it leads to a different set of investments. It leads to a different weighing of priorities. And so this is the most basic element of right view. Actually, I remember, when I was first getting into Buddhism, before became a Buddhist, I was kind of an atheist and didn't believe in any type of afterlife whatsoever. Just thought that this was it. After this, then, we're gone. And that kind of attitude leads to a really different calculation and where a person places the weight in their life. Because if after death it's all just some kind of a peaceful oblivion, we're kind of destroyed, then the priority in life becomes to get as much sensual, for one can become to get as much external sense gratification, sense pleasures as possible. And so when a person has this kind of attitude, you can get external things like external, cars or houses or whatever it may be. You can get those in all kinds of ways, and not all of them are moral. But you tend to judge your kind of your success in life on the basis of the number of external pleasures you experience. So how many vacations a person's gone on, what trips they've seen. This is especially the case if a person believes there's just this one lifetime and that's it. So that leads to a very kind of different calculation for a person. And when a person has this view, if there really is something after death, if they invest wrongly, those consequences come up to them. They kind of reap those consequences. So when a person has this view that there's basically just this one life, it becomes kind of the calculation on how much time, how much effort to invest in one's practice gets really changed quite a lot. Kind of in that case, practicing the Buddha's teachings basically makes sense as a kind of, as a part of a lifestyle aimed at external gratification. So if a person is having kind of like, a little bit of difficulty in their job, stress at work, then Buddhist practice becomes something aimed at alleviating that stress so that a person can get back to the business of, of kind of enjoying their life, of, getting back to whatever it is, having good times. And so this is actually what you often see in Buddhism in the West. Actually, Buddhism, as it came to the West, it came through the gate of Western psychology, and so it generally has, what often tends to happen is it can have this attitude, or sometimes, in some cases, my own at least, I know coming to Buddhism, can have this kind of attitude, well, this may teach me a set of techniques that I can use to get the most gratification externally, to get the, maybe, I can't remember if my attitude was exactly that, but in general, wanted to use it to do better at school, have a better relationship, all these, various things that people aim at. It's basically external things. And so when a person has this kind of calculation for Buddhist practice, then a lot of the difficult elements of Buddhist practice don't seem worth it. Doesn't seem worth it to invest, say, 20, 30 years giving up or renouncing things, because at the end of the day, you've only got another 10 years left, even if you attain Nibbana, attain the end of suffering, and when you were 70 and you had 10 more years left and it was all a peaceful oblivion, then most of the Buddha's past stops making sense, stops having much meaning. If, on the other hand, a person has this view that, there is good and bad actions, there are the devas, there is this world and the next, there is mother and father, then a person's investments become really different. Actually, the Buddha teaches about different worlds, in terms of the heavens, they can last a really long time. It's kind of, being a king. If a person were to just basically control the entire world as a human king, then the pleasures of heaven, they seem to outstrip those. Even at the lowest level of heaven, the lifespan of those devas is really long. It's something like 1 day and 1 night is equal to 50 years, and as you go up 1 day and 1 night, it's equal to 100 years, and their lifespan keeps going up and up. So I think the lowest level, it's a day and a night is 50 years, and they live about 500 years. And also these devas have like all these different powers, so things that humans have to use a lot of technology for, have to have a lot of money for, they just do automatically. They can kind of travel wherever they want immediately. They can read people's minds a lot of the time. They have kind of almost magic powers to some of the time to influence the world around them. And the types of external sensual pleasures that devas experience, they're a different order in some cases almost than humans. It's almost like, if a human sees a dog and the dog's kind of rooting around, doing its thing as a dog can't imagine certain, types of pleasure that humans have. Like they can't imagine the pleasure of like reading a book. They can't, a dog probably couldn't imagine what it'd be like going in a plane. They don't have the context, for you. I mean, you could put a dog on a plane, but it wouldn't really know. It might be frightened, what was going on. So these various types of things, like the pleasures of, say, like conversation, or of intellectual, intellectual contemplation. These kind of things, dogs don't have the capacity to do, really, and kind of their capacity to communicate with one another, with humans, is very limited, and so they have a certain set of sensual pleasures. And in the same way, kind of people look at dogs and their sensual pleasures and think, well, I don't really want that. Kind of, you feed a dog dog food, it doesn't look that appetizing. Think, oh, that's okay, but things are pretty good with me here. In the same way, devas have a type of pleasure that's on a different order. There's actually some devas who that's all they experience. They just experience happiness. And people who develop the jhanas and have that as a basis in their mind, when they die, they get reborn as a deva, and it seems like they just experience jhanas all the time. It's kind of just there's some of them that said they feed on delight, and they kind of go around uttering, oh, what bliss. And they have these immense lifespans that are much, much longer than normal human lifespans. They're measured in aeons, the amount of time that a universe takes to evolve and devolve. And so for this reason, when a person has this idea, their calculation about what they're going to put into their practice in this life changes. All of a sudden, spending 20, 30 years practicing meditation, doing good deeds, doesn't seem like such a bad investment, because in another 10 years down the line, that investment may pay off. And in the same way, even if a person has done evil deeds their whole life, they've got 5 years left to live, there's still a motivation to change their evil actions into good ones, try to put their feet in the right direction, because there's this possibility that, in the same way that somebody said it changes the course on a ship, that, before the ship hits a precipice, maybe before the ship goes off of Niagara Falls or something like that, you kind of change the direction around. Then in that case, there's still the possibility that ship could reach safety. And in the same way, for somebody, even if they have 5 years left to live, or, like however old they are, there's still this kind of motivation, there's still this kind of desire that comes in to make a change. So this right view has the most impact, kind of the most important part of the path. But this is just how the Buddha explains it in these basic terms. In general, it just means having a kind of right understanding of what to do in one's practice for the sake of going towards Nibbana. Having a right understanding, we could take it to mean that, having a right understanding of what's wholesome, what's unwholesome, and what the path is that leads to Nibbana. This is kind of right view. So actually, when a person achieves stream entry, then it tends to be expressed in terms of a view. It's whatever is subject to origination is subject to cessation. And a person who achieves this, it seems that they can no longer, on a deep mental level, take in certain external things to be permanent, and so spend their lives deliberately chasing them. Their lives are fixed. They see these things as impermanent on, I guess you'd say, a deep level. They're no longer able to lie to themselves about that. And so their actions go in line with that, go towards Nibbana. So this right view is the foremost member of the path, the chief member of the path. And there's many ways that views can be right, many ways it can be wrong. This is another thing about the Noble Eightfold Path. They all have a right component and they have a wrong component. There's right view, wrong view. So the next portion of the Noble Eightfold Path is right intention. And this kind of, I think, is the intention, again, I didn't study this beforehand, but basically the intention of renunciation, the intention of non-harming, intention of non-ill will. And so this one, just to kind of go back to what we were talking about a bit before, this intention of renunciation is one that often for Westerners is something really difficult. It seems like a sheer drop-off. Actually, the Buddha's teachings on renunciation are such, you can see the lifestyle of a monk. They give up many things. It's kind of the lifestyle that the Buddha set up for people who wanted to achieve Nibbana. It's kind of you give up, you basically become a person who wants to strive full-time, they become celibate. They refrain from certain types of eating, they refrain from entertainment, they refrain from all these various things. And this refraining, this intention, is actually what gives them a bit of space to grow in their meditation practice. It's like if you had a kind of a big field. My grandfather used to live in the country, And all around him there would be these kind of fields. So you'd have his house, and then you'd have these kind of fields. And he said when he was young, these fields had these massive trees around them. So it was his job, one of his jobs as a young man, was to go in and kind of saw these trees down. So he said, they're so big, you could have like one person on the other hand, you could both grab around the tree, and the tree would be that big. And his job was to saw them down. And then I think they had to maybe people had to remove the stumps after that and all of this. And all of this was to try to get the land cleared so that people could plant crops in that land, and so that those seeds could grow, so then they could become farmers' fields. But before you could plant these crops, the whole thing had to be cleared. All the big trees had to be cut down, all these various things had to be removed, and only then could the seeds that get planted grow well. I mean, you might be able to throw some seeds in the woods or whatever, and maybe one or two plants would grow, but in terms of reaping a big harvest, it needed to be cleared first. And it's something similar when a person has this intention to keep grabbing on to external delights, when they are really attached to their job, to their status, to their house, to their car, really attached to entertainment, really attached to food, really attached to company, really attached to family, really attached to all these various things. It's like having these very big trees in the middle of the field. Those trees are large, some of them have huge branches, and they cast a lot of shade. And when this big tree with a big crown, a big canopy is there casting shade, then things, you want to plant some other seeds, they can't grow in the shade of that tree. That tree needs to be cleared first, or at least some people, if they remain in the household life, they can't totally clear their field, but there are certain trees they can cut down so that they have space to plant. And there are maybe some trees they can transplant, move somewhere else, so that they have space. But in any event, this intention of renunciation is kind of the precursor to moving forward in one's practice. It's the precursor to having a meditation that's sustainable. Because when a person develops a lifestyle based around renouncing certain external sensual things, this is when their meditation can kind of take, when it gives it the kind of the fertile ground, a cleared field with fertile soil that they can plant these Dhamma seeds in. There's actually a sutta where the Buddha says that I think it's basically impossible to enter the first jhana if a person doesn't see the dangers in external sensual pleasures. In other words, these kind of big trees block other good plants from growing. The difficulty here, of course, is that there's a time when the field is being cleared, and still no seeds are planted, still no seeds have grown, still no seeds have borne fruit. And so it feels like one doesn't have the benefits of one doesn't have the benefits of the other. And this is where some of the difficulties of practice come in, where one needs to have this quality of endurance. And again, this feeds back into the first factor, which is right view, that a person needs to have this right view, that investing in this has these very good long-term consequences, which is what makes it all worthwhile. The second two are the intention of non-harming and non-ill will. So basically, as far as I remember, I think I've got those right. Non-harming basically means you don't desire to see like cruel things happen to another person. And non-ill will basically means that one doesn't have hatred for another person. Now these two things, like non-harming, non-ill will, they can seem like a kind of overlap, like almost like the same thing. But actually, sometimes you can have kind of a no hatred for a person, but you can want to see them suffer. So actually a lot of comedy is often this way. Like a person wants to see, something really bad happen to person X, and when it happens, it's really funny, So this is the kind of aspect of cruelty that can be in one's mind, this desire to harm. And then there's this desire for ill will. If a person, has this kind of, hatred for another person, that also blocks their ability to progress in meditation. So I think that I told this story one time before at TBC when I was young, just a young man starting to practice meditation. I was in high school, and found I was getting a lot of benefits out of meditation. But then there came this actually I didn't tell this part. There was this one time this fellow at my high school came, And high schools are not always the nicest place. And he came with his friends and he beat up, all of my friends. And all of my friends, we were it was the last year of high school, so people were going on to university. But we felt like, okay, we want to, go punch them back too, kind of get them back. But I can still remember very vividly, like whenever, I had this intention to get revenge on these people, to kind of harm them or whatever it may be, then the benefits I was getting from meditation totally fell off. I couldn't get anywhere in my meditation practice. Kind of like this, if somebody was trying to walk forward, but instead they had this big chain tied around them and tied to a tree or something, they could only walk so far before the chain jerked them back. That's kind of how it is when a person is yoked to ill will, yoked to cruelty. And the same thing as well when a person is yoked, when they're tied to external houses, cars, external sensual things like this. So this is something that's like a chain that a person has tied themselves to because they think it's going to give them pleasure. But actually, being tied to these things, a person can only advance so far in their meditation practice before it pulls them back. And you kind of see these dogs, sometimes they get tied up on a leash, and the leash gets tied to a tree, and the dog just kind of maybe runs around the pole or runs around a tree, just running and running and running. And so long as we have tied ourselves to these things, to non-renunciation, we've tied ourselves to the external world, we've tied ourselves to hatred, we've tied ourselves to harming. Our practice can be like this. It can just be like running around, this pole, running around in a circle and not getting to our destination. So that's right intention. So that's right view, right intention. So then the next one is right speech. Now, right speech is basically four kinds. Basically, not speaking divisively, not telling lies, not speaking divisively. Not speaking like harshly, and not speaking idly. So not telling lies is the one that's in the precepts. It's pretty kind of basic. There was this one fellow was walking. Just double check my time here. Oh my gosh, already 20 minutes. And I was walking in the subway with my friend who's a monk. And actually, I think maybe I was by myself at that time. But in any event, he asked. He said, I can understand it, the importance of not telling lies, but how do you go through life if you got to just say things to people all the time? Just kind of paraphrasing here. And what it said to him was, well, not telling lies doesn't mean you have to tell everybody exactly what's on your mind all the time. Just kind of blurt out what a person is thinking. If you think somebody, if you're at work and you think your boss's tie isn't good, doesn't mean you go up to your boss and say, you've got an ugly tie. There is room for kind of diplomacy. In other words, a person doesn't tell a lie. They don't go up to your boss and say, nice tie. But also, it doesn't mean we have to go up to our boss and comment on his tie at all. And if our boss says, oh, what do you think about my new tie? Then we could say something to him like, oh yeah, where'd you get it from? And then, change the topic. What store is that? These kind of things. Or, oh yeah, did you get your shoes there too? Those are nice shoes. In other words, there's many different skillful ways that a person can avoid lying, but not have to be brutally honest. So this is kind of around not telling lies, this aspect of right speech. The next one is harsh speech. Basically means, speaking this kind of like very blunt, aggressive, inconsiderate way of speaking. And if you ever go to Asia or hang around Sri Lanka or Thailand, they have this very indirect kind of way of speaking. So if they want you to know something, then they'll try to say it in this way that you'll pick up what they want, but it's not like they told you. So then what that does for you is it gives you the opportunity to do what they want, to give them what they want, and externally it's not like they forced you to do it. It's more like you had this. You chose to do it. They kind of let you know. So this type of way of interacting with people is a good skill to learn. especially if one was raised in the West. Western culture has many excellent things to it, and certainly in some situations it can be a strength to be very direct and very specific. Especially, okay, we're building a bridge, like how many, how tall is it going to be? How much gravel are we going to need, or whatever it may be. That's the time when being very specific in one's language, being very direct, can be good. Or I was reading this story, reading about kind of plane crashes a while back, and apparently when people use indirect language, you've got this pilot and this co-pilot. If there's a pilot and a co-pilot, and the co-pilot's like, oh, those clouds look a little dark, if the pilot's already tired, that plane can crash. And so they found this kind of continuously, that when there was a company or whatever, there was this huge gap in authority between the pilot and the co-pilot. There was a lot of plane crashes because the co-pilot wouldn't tell the pilot when he was doing something wrong. So again, this is an area where direct speech can be beneficial. But there's many areas as well where kind of this harsh, direct speech, is better. It's better to use more subtle means of communication. Better to, where'd you get that tie? From this store. Did you get your shoes there too? Better to communicate like that. Or if somebody, your friend, you're out with them, they really want to go to this restaurant, you don't really want to go. It's like, oh yeah, what do they serve there? Burgers? Yeah, I was thinking more about a salad or something like that. So these kind of indirect modes of speech are polite, and they give the person the opportunity to offer to change their behavior, offer to change their way of doing things, without appearing that they've kind of like succumbed to some like harsh request. And what that does is it creates this feeling of goodwill between people and their relationships. Actually, when there's an economy of gifts, an economy of one person giving something to another person, this is the type of communication that's really important, this subtle communication. When there's an economy of an exchange where it's like, you give me this widget and I'll give you $5, that's when specific direct communication is really important. So good to have this skill to know how to speak gently, to speak kind words, to speak non-harshly, to know how to speak indirectly. This is kind of a very important skill to have. So then we have, what did we go? We covered lying, we covered harsh speech, we haven't covered idle chatter. So basically idle chatter here is, covers like talk of the well, like talking about, the news or Donald Trump, or talking about, television or whatever it might be. All these things are kind of types of idle chatter. It's kind of just time-wasting talk. And the Buddha recommends instead of this that a person talk about the Dhamma. They talk about kind of solitude, about not getting bound up with other people, about virtue, about concentration, or they talk about necessary things like necessary work projects. And what this tends to do is it tends to create relationships with other people where one is talking about things that are practical. And what that means is that the rest of one's time, one has more time to oneself to practice meditation. Now, as a layperson, this kind of thing can be a bit more tricky to swing. There's a lot more vagaries in lay life than there are in monastic life. But what one can do is to try to develop a skill around this. Like especially if, one's friend or something like that is going through a rough time. Okay, that's a time when, fine to sit down and, maybe catch up on things or, listen to them or whatever it might be. So it's not necessarily like a hard and fast rule, never to engage in idle speech. Actually, what you see with some really skilled senior monks is that if they see one monk is having like a tough time, they'll come over and joke with him and talk with him and all these things. And especially when they first meet people after a long time, they'll engage in this kind of like friendly conversation, which one even sees the Buddha doing. So then we have lying, harsh speech, idle speech, and the other one was divisive speech. So this is basically speech where you hear like a rumor about somebody and you go use that kind of rumor to split one friend from the other, and kind of splitting people apart with your speech. Now the interesting thing about these, just double check my time, 3 types of speech, idle speech, harsh speech, divisive speech, is that there are times when you can see the Buddha engaging in idle speech, harsh speech, and divisive speech. So you can see him engaging in idle speech when he first meets people. You can see him engaging in harsh speech when he scolds misbehaving monks. You can see him engaging in divisive speech, especially with his cousin Devadatta, telling people not to associate with bad friends. But one thing you never see him doing is lying. So that's the one that's kind of more carte blanche. There's no real skillful way to lie, although the other types of speech may have their time and place to them. So that's, we covered right view, right intention, right speech, right action. So basically, right action means non-harming, more or less, view, right intention, right speech, right action. Basically non-harming, like not, not killing, not stealing, these kind of various types of actions. And this one wants to refrain from those things. And again, refraining from these things is like keeping the field cleared, not kind of putting muddy water, not having a nice fertile field and, pouring some bleach on it, or not having a nice fertile field and, pouring some terrible chemical that ruins the field. These kind of wrong actions, actions that are harmful to oneself, harmful to other people, these are the kind of things that destroy our field, so that the seeds we plant don't grow. And in some cases, they can even destroy plants that are growing up already. This is especially one of the things with this, especially, is like anger. To try to avoid having this feeling of anger. This leads to a lot of kind of the harming that comes, kind of external harsh speech, external, harming, stomping, and killing or whatever. A lot of it comes from anger, a lot of the time. Although, of course, not the only thing that it can come from. But one of the most common, especially possibly in usual daily Western life, is kind of this anger, you kind of spreading out. And then when one goes to sit down and meditate, then one has a hard time. So then we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So right livelihood is one of the trickiest ones as a kind of, as a lay person, because lay people's lifestyles are so varied, and the things that are required in the various professions are so different. So basically the Buddha defines right livelihood as not engaging in, trading with like human beings or with weapons or living beings, chemicals, these kind of things. There's also suttas where he speaks against being an actor and speaks against being a warrior, like a professional soldier, and says that actors and professional soldiers, it seems like they, they're headed for a bad fate. So basically, with right livelihood, the precepts are often one's guide for that. I mean, avoiding these kind of trade in weapons, trade in living beings, don't, all these various things. But other than that, the number of professions that there are just so huge that a person's keeping the 5 precepts very strictly. Oh, trading in alcohol is another one. That helps to protect one. So remember, actually, when I was a university student, about to get out of university, and I was living at this Zen temple, and this fellow came to the Zen temple one time, and he had this really nice car, like a Porsche. And I was in business school at that time, but also maybe thinking about becoming a monk. And anyways, this fellow, we got to talking after he'd been there for a while, and he says, what's your degree? Like, what are you taking in school? I said, I'm taking business. And he said, oh, well, I've got a stock market company, and and this is kind of like your dream job. And he said, I'm looking for somebody to build equity indexes, I guess, indexes of stocks. He was kind of, I guess he'd take like a kind of maybe a theme or something and get a bunch of stocks, but get a bunch of companies together, and then maybe sell those as packages to investors or something. I'm not 100% sure. But he said, I'm looking for somebody to do that, and then I could just come and tweak them. And he said, would you be interested? And I was like, well, yeah. Kind of, it'd be wonderful, like a great start to my life, to my business career. And I remember going back and reading, looking up his company online. And this was shortly after 9/11. It was kind of maybe like 2004, 2000, something like that, 2004, I think. And so mainly the types of stocks that he was building, it seemed like he was building index for, were Homeland Security stocks. In other words, these kind of various defense companies who, some of them might have been, the private security companies who did like bad things, and various other, very like, maybe in Iraq, and, other of them might have been, I don't know, some kind of weapons manufacturers. But this would have been a very, nice start to career. But thankfully didn't end up going that route. Although not to say this fellow didn't seem like an evil man or anything like that. But this is just a kind of example, and I'm sure everybody has their own. I became a monk after, so I don't know much about the working life. But sure, everybody has their kind of own examples of basically moral dilemmas that one faces in one's work life, where a boss might want them to lie, boss might want them to steal, these various things. I knew a gentleman who was a veterinarian, and he would kill animals in his job. And so that right there is that aspect of his job is a mode of wrong livelihood, But again, he faced so much pressure from people to do it that he ended up doing it. So these types of elements of a person's job that are unskillful are elements that one wants to cut out. And this is probably one of the aspects of practicing the Noble Eightfold Path as a layperson that might be the trickiest. So from there we have right effort, which is basically the 4 right efforts. And to put them together in a nutshell, it's basically the effort to avoid bad qualities, the effort to develop good qualities, the effort to maintain the good qualities that have arisen, and the effort to kind of get rid of bad qualities that have already arisen. So in other words, it's an all-around effort, all-around trying to grow in wholesome qualities, to grow in the Dhamma, to grow in the things that the Buddha said were good, and to decline in the things that he said were bad. So this makes an important point along with renunciation, is that the Buddhist path of practice is one that requires a lot of effort, requires a lot of trying, requires a lot of energy, because to train one's mind, to restrain it from doing the things that are unwholesome that it likes to do, is something that's really difficult to do. It can take a lot of energy. As anybody who's ever quit smoking or quit drinking or quit whatever bad habit it may be, you know how much mental energy that kind of thing can take. But our practice as people wanting to attain Nibbana is basically like a lifestyle of doing that. Not just quitting smoking, but then going on to quit hatred. Then one can go on to quit sensuality entirely. These are basically addictions or habits that one wants to cut. And so this requires a lot of effort, a lot of restraint. Sometimes it requires the effort of just watching. That's effective. For some things, sometimes it requires very active efforts. And all around all these things is this basic, trying, not to let unwholesome qualities stay in one's mind, trying to make wholesome qualities grow, trying to be able to do the things that the Buddha talks about in the canon. It's kind of right effort. So the second last one is right mindfulness, and this kind of right mindfulness is basically it's defined as the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And mindfulness in the Buddhist teachings, I think nowadays the general understanding is changing. But when I first became a Buddhist, there was this understanding that mindfulness was just this bare, open, receptive awareness. I mean, now I think that that has changed, and in the canon it's mostly described as this active faculty that involves memory, basically involves the ability to keep something in mind. So it involves both being able to remember what the Buddhist teachings were, keep them in mind, and there can also be some comparison there. Am I doing this thing or am I not doing this thing, So if one knows that anger is coming up, one is mindful, to know whether anger has arisen or not, whether it's growing or diminishing or not, whether what one's doing is growing or diminishing. At the same time, one can also be mindful of what Buddhist teachings about anger were. One can also be mindful about the effect that trying to apply his teachings has. Is my anger diminishing? Am I doing this right? Am I doing this not right? So this faculty of mindfulness basically means to be able to keep something in mind. It also has this element of memory. And it also has this element to it. It's often coupled, the word for mindfulness is sati. It's often coupled with sampajanya. Sampajanya means basically alertness. It's kind of this just knowing what's going on. So when a person has this kind of right mindfulness intact, coupled with right effort, What it basically means is that the thrust of one's life, what one's doing during the day, isn't so much kind of, okay, what's going on, what's over there, what new site, what's on that billboard. All the time, for people who are trying to practice for Nibbana, they're constantly engaged in trying to grow in the Buddhist teachings. Constantly engaged. They're trying to, basically from the time they get up to the time they go to sleep, full time, everything they do in their life, they're trying to relate to the Buddhist teachings, trying to relate to growing in wholesome qualities, trying to relate to declining in unwholesome qualities. And this faculty of mindfulness is this faculty that stops the mind from wandering out to some place where it's not supposed to be. So the Buddha gives this simile for mindfulness, kind of like of a monkey who goes wandering in these uneven areas, and when he goes wandering in these even areas, then he gets stuck in this trap, and a hunter skewers him. And he says if that monkey stayed in a safe place, then he wouldn't have been caught. And the safe place here is these 4 foundations of mindfulness. In other words, basically always having our mind on Dhamma development, not letting it rush out to various external things, not letting it, kind of drift away in some fantasy. Now, when these things are all together, when a person's field is cleared, when they've got right view, right action, their speech is good, when their livelihood isn't something that's dragging them down, when they have right effort, they're trying to grow in wholesome qualities, and when they have right mindfulness especially, their mind isn't just constantly shifting here and there, constantly churning up and thinking all the time, then that's when they sit down to focus on their meditation object or walk or whatever. They develop a right samadhi. It's kind of a samma samadhi, or right concentration. And this is the kind of the last element of the Noble Eightfold Path. It basically means these jhanas. Right concentration means the arising of the first, second, third, and fourth jhana. And these are all states in the canon described as full body awareness, and basically starting from the first one, those jhanas are very pleasant things. So a person who's never experienced them will not have experienced that type of pleasant feeling before in their life until they experience a jhana. It's a different order of happiness. It's called happiness on the level of form. So all these various elements of the Noble Eightfold Path interact with one another. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be the case that a person, gets out their checkbook. First, I'm going to work on right view, and then a couple of years later, it'll be right action. All of them kind of interact all the time. So they can be used in a certain sense as a checklist. I mean, do I have right samadhi or don't I? Do I have right view or don't I? Do I have renunciation or don't I? All these various things. But in general, the Buddhist path is kind of like, like watering a plant. You got the water, you've got the soil, you've got the sunshine. All of these things interact, and they interact sometimes in complex ways to make the plant grow. But still, when a person is a skilled farmer, when they're watching the seed, they can kind of get a sense from the plant if it's drooping, if it's upright, does it need more sun, does it need more water, is there something wrong with the soil? In the same way, in our own practice, it doesn't have to be like this complicated, intellectual analysis of the Noble Eightfold Path. One can intuitively know, what are my wholesome qualities? What are my unwholesome qualities? What wholesome quality do I need to work on now? Do I need to try to make grow? What unwholesome quality now do I need to diminish? And in this way, one can learn to proceed in one's practice of the Noble Eightfold Path in a way that's very simple and yet very practical. How do I make the wholesome qualities I want grow? How do I move forward in the Buddhist teachings? And these are aspects, all of the Noble Eightfold Path, of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And maybe one final, couple final points about the Noble Eightfold Path is that one of the important things about the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddhist teachings, is that it's a fabricated path. So in other words, it's not the same as Nibbana. We put this path together, it's fabricated, we build it, but it leads to something that's deathless. So we're not using something deathless to attain something deathless, we're creating something that will lead us to the deathless. So in other words, this is something that requires fabrication. It requires using samsara to overcome samsara. And on that same note, this is a path that's built on desire. This is a kind of very interesting thing. Venerable Ananda gives the simile of a person who wants to go to the park, and when he gets to the park, his desire to go to the park is allayed. So the development of the Noble Eightfold Path, the development of the Buddha's teachings, is founded on this desire. Like for a person to develop it, they have to really want it. And they really want it because they understand through right view what the dangers of not developing it are and what the benefits of developing it are. And so with this desire, one makes these investments. Sometimes you read the biographies of the Ajahns who've attained Nibbana. Their lives were not easy. Like they were, doing a lot of difficult things to practice, meditating long hours, going without food sometimes, all these various things. So when a person comes to Buddhism, it's usually because they have this kind of right view start, developing, which is that there's a lot of suffering and external things that I'm chasing afterwards. So from there comes this desire, what is it that I can do to try to find an end to this suffering? Whereas the end of this whole massive suffering, that's usually the way they put it in the canon. And the Buddha describes the path to the end of this suffering as the Noble Eightfold Path. It's a path that, because of desire, we put together, we create. And it's for this reason that he describes it as the highest among fabricated things, this Noble Eightfold Path. It's the highest among fabricated things because it leads to something unfabricated. So that's where this kind of desire gets allayed. So although the path is founded on desire of a type, this desire to find an end to suffering, when one achieves that desire is allayed. And the Buddha says, that there is the unborn, the unformed, the uncreated, the unoriginated. If there wasn't the unborn, then etc., then there wouldn't be an escape from the formed. But because there's the unborn, there is an escape from the formed. And the escape is through this Noble Eightfold Path. We put it together to lead us to the unborn, to the unformed, to the uncreated, to the unoriginated. We put it together to lead us to Nibbana, to lead us to the end of suffering. And this is why it's the highest among all fabricated things. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and hope that everybody in Toronto has a great day, and wishing you all the best.